Today, we're going to be speaking with Valerie Fridland, who's professor of linguistics at the University of Nevada, Reno, and author of the new book, Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. She also writes a monthly blog in Psychology Today. Valerie, really great to have you on. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And you did so well with that intonation pattern for my book title. I love it.
So listen, when it comes to language, every time that on the program we talk about language and we talk about less versus fewer, or the use of literally to mean metaphorically, or words like, hey, regardless and irregardless seem to mean the same thing, or any of these things, invariably someone will write in and say, David, all of this stuff about grammar and vocabulary, it's all really relative. Right and wrong is only in a sort of culturally determined context. It can change over time. It's not like 1 + 1 = 2. And so what's right at the end of the day is just what is culturally accepted. To what degree is that analysis of language accurate?
Well, scientifically and historically, it's very accurate. But from a prescriptive standpoint, I think you have a lot of people that argue with it. It's really hard for us to get out of what we've been taught as children, what we've learned to believe socially, and see language from a more distant perspective, from where we step back and we think, can history teach us? What can science teach us about the way that language evolves and how natural that is? But it's really hard for us to step back and get that perspective. And I think that's a really smart person who's writing in, but it's not an opinion shared by most everyday talkers, right? It's not what we think about when we're telling someone. It's not me and him went to the store. It's he and I went to the store. When our parents correct us, they're not thinking, oh, yeah, well, science tells me differently.
When it comes to words that enter the lexicon as sort of the word like has done in many situations as a kind of placeholder, or the use of literally when you don't actually mean literally, what is the mechanism through which these words appear and sort of replicate themselves in the language?
The mechanism is really our tendency as humans to constantly be using language in novel ways. And we push the boundaries of meaning because we have either a new experience we want to describe that some aspect of meaning of that word fit, or we repurpose it because some parts of that meaning are important to what we want to say, but it doesn't work how it was. I mean, I think a great example is today you see a lot of kids say, oh gosh, adulting sucks. And people make fun of that because, of course, it's taking a noun and making it to a verb. But
Right.
this is a tendency we've had through the history of language. In fact, Shakespeare's famous for doing this. And parenting is a verb that came from a noun only in the 20th century. For centuries prior to that, people didn't do parenting, they were parents. And it's only in the mid 20th century we start to see that expansion. So it's just our natural tendency to be metaphorical. We use language metaphorically in everyday ways, not in the way of ninth grade when you were analyzing Romeo and Juliet and you had to pick out the similes and the metaphors. We think of metaphors as being this big thing that's hard to do, but we speak metaphorically all the time. And that is what drives language change forward.
There is a ton of, I guess we would call it value judgment applied not only to certain accents and dialects, but also sometimes the simplicity with which some people speak. For example, there were linguistic analyses done of the former president Donald Trump, and it would be discussed whether it's true or not that he would deliver most speeches at what would be considered a fourth grade level, and how we measure that we can talk about, and how accurate that is may vary. But there were those who used that to say, this is a deficit, and it points to a deficit in terms of the substance of what he is saying. Others who said, actually, it's an incredibly useful and smart way to speak to people because you're ensuring that no one is going to feel left out because they either don't understand the words or they don't know what. There's these kind of two sides to it. What are some perspectives we might apply to think about those two sides?
That's a really, really interesting question because I think there are two different angles you can take here. There is the idea of what we want leaders to talk like, what we expect CEOs to sound like. And then there's the idea of being able to reach people and have people empathize and see your point of view. And I think politicians have been really adept at managing those two things, where certain politicians, I think Trump is certainly one of them, Sarah Palin was another, reach people by being people, by feeling reachable, by talking like those people, by sort of clinging on to the casual, colloquial, informal nature of language. It's a mistake to see that as simpler talk because that's really not true. That's not what how language works. There is no such thing as simpler talk. It's simply different talk. But I think what we talk about when we're measuring complexity is lexemes. We're measuring vocabulary and the amount and range of vocabulary. So how many different words do they use? How many more educated or learned words do they use? And that's a little different of a measure than just saying, is someone's speech structurally simpler? And certainly his speech wasn't structurally simpler, but I think he didn't use as many vocabulary items and the diversity of vocabulary that other people did, and that was used as the measure. It depends on what you want in a leader. And I think if you identify being a man of the people as what you're aiming for, then Trump really has that one in hand. If you're identifying someone who's a leader and can sort of speak at a level above the everyday person to solve world problems, then maybe he doesn't. So it's really different perspectives on what we want.
What you said, maybe simpler isn't the right word to apply, at least in some of these cases. If we think about literature and you think about, I don't know, just to pick two different styles of fiction, not that these are the ultimately representative examples, but if you think about, like, for example, the writings of Proust or Proust, depending on your preference of pronunciation, and then something like Harlan Coben. And I love both, so I'm passing no value judgments, but there is a facility with which you can page through a Harlan Coben novel that you can't with Proust. It seems that it is partially vocabulary, partially structure, partially that Coben tends to write more dialogue and just present tense, here's what's happening, whereas there is more characters thinking out loud in Proust. Like, what are the factors that make literature easier or more difficult to read, I guess is the way I would ask it.
Well, I think, one key question is who sold more books
True.
to see which one has been more successful. But
Yeah.
I think it's really important here to mention that there are measures of literary skill that differ, and a lot of it is structural. A lot of it is their facility in using language in a symbolic way. A lot of it is vocabulary diversity. But written language and spoken language are fundamentally different. And so you can't really take what we were talking about with Trump and oral speech and compare it to two different pieces of literature, because you learn how to write. No 2-year-old knows how to write. I mean, they play and they scribble, but they don't know how to write innately. It's not something that is emergent as a skill. But babies are essentially born talking, and no one teaches a baby to talk. They absorb input from the environment that, triggers their linguistic abilities. But a 2-year-old can talk quite well. A 3-year-old is amazing, and they've never gone to school, but they can't write. And when we look at literature, the history of writing is thousands of years younger than the history of spoken language. And in fact, mass literacy didn't exist until about 100, 200 years ago. So fundamentally different skills. But literature differs on the learning of those skills, the practicing of those skills. And language is very different. And when it's spoken, everybody practices languages every day. Right? We're all talking all the time. So there's no measure of I'm more practiced at this. There might be a measure of I'm more institutionally educated and pick up the words that are associated with that institutional education. And I think that's the same in your comparison of literature. There's someone that's writing to be approachable, and they're writing in everyday, more spoken, colloquial style. And then you have the literary canon, of course, with writers that practice it as a skill, who rewrote 50 million times and who are aiming for a stylistic approach that's a little different.
That's super interesting. To take a specific example that's kind of in the political, cultural discussion right now, there's a lot of discussion about the use of the singular they when we're talking about an individual whose gender we may not know or who identifies as non-binary. And defenders of this say that actually hundreds of years ago, there was a relatively common use of singular they in older English. There are others who say that it's some kind of a destruction of the language. In this context that you write about and talk about of the sort of evolving nature of language, how would we apply that to the use of singular they for this cultural reason that we're seeing?
Absolutely. I mean, singular they is a great example of a place where we should look back at history to understand the current moment. And pronouns have always been caught up in cultural change. And this is not true of just today. It's been true many times in past centuries. And in fact, they is not even a native English pronoun. I don't think people realize that. The pronominal paradigm or the types of pronouns we had in Old English were actually quite different. And they came from the Vikings. It was a borrowing from Old Norse. And in Chaucer, in fact, you can see Chaucer switching between they, and in the accusative case, instead of them, he used the Old English pronoun hem. So when you say go see 'em, that's actually a remnant of Old English hem, not them. So it's really fascinating evolution. But if you look at the pronouns in the early modern period, where we went from having thou, thee, and you and ye and you to just having you, that was actually driven by social cultural change. It was massive changes in the social structure of London that brought a rising middle class, and it made society more democratic and egalitarian, which it really hadn't been prior to that. So you didn't any longer want to recognize status with your pronouns because you could get in trouble. You could insult someone. You could be challenged to a duel because you pissed someone off because you thou'd them, which was an insult if it was someone that was your equal or higher. And in fact, Shakespeare plays with this all the time in his plays. If thou thou'st him some thrice, it shall not be amiss, is in fact a line from Shakespeare where he's saying if you thou him and it's incorrect, it could be a problem. So you became the symbol of equality. And this was actually not well accepted by grammarians or by the some of the religious groups, because they felt that it was an insult to God because it was putting people above God. So this idea of pronouns bothering us is not new, nor is the idea of pronominal shift. And they was used as a singular they as far back as Chaucer. We see Chaucer using it this way. So from the 13th century on, there are cases of this. The novelty today is it's used as a non-binary pronoun, and it wasn't used that way 700 years ago. It was used as an epicene or all-gender pronoun. So that's, I think, what's bothering a lot of people is this use with words that we have marked for gender. So instead of saying everyone should check their ticket to see what time it's at, right, where that they sort of sneaks in, and it should be a he or she, grammatically, prescriptively, but we use they. Everybody does that. But Kelly likes their coffee with cream and sugar. That's the type of they that bothers us. And that's probably because Kelly, in many people's cognitive grammar, is marked for feminine gender or marked for masculine gender, depending on your experience with that term. And so it's semantically incongruent with they for people that aren't versed and practiced in using it that way. And I think when people find it uncomfortable grammatically in their mental stages of accepting a new thing, it feels bad. It feels wrong. But as soon as people are practiced and accepting of it, sort of millennials and younger, it doesn't seem as wrong. And research bears that out. Millennials don't have nearly the trouble that us old folks do.
Last thing I want to ask about on that note, what are some of the linguistic shifts that we're most prominently seeing among Gen Z?
Well, I think there's a couple of things I will predict will not be around in another decade or two, and that is the subjunctive, because we have was, were leveling. No one ever says if I were a rich man anymore. If I was a rich man is really the change. And these are subtle changes. That's what I'm more interested in as a linguist rather than new vocabulary.
Yeah.
The other thing is adverbial ly is going the way of the dodo. So, you don't drive slowly anymore, you drive slow. And I think that is definitely in younger speakers, the more prominent pattern.
Interesting. I have not noticed that. And I think, obviously I'm not Gen Z, I'm a millennial, but that millennials are still very much using the ly, right?
I wouldn't say very much. I think you can catch a millennial not using it as much, but what we do see is a drop off in its use as the generations, because language change goes slowly. So it's usually started in one group and continuing in another. The other thing I think Gen Z is incorporating is a lot more variety from which they draw the new forms and fashions that they're using. And for example, African American English is much more prominent in Gen Z language than it is in older groups.
And that's regardless of location or just on average, it's more prevalent.
On average, a lot of the new vocabulary, and I think a lot of that is internet access has really made those types of words that are prominent and new in African American English become accessible for young people in the white suburbs that want to sound cool.
Very, very interesting. The book is Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. We've been speaking with the book's author, Valerie Fridland, who's a professor of linguistics at the University of Nevada, Reno. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Absolutely. It's been a blast. Thanks for having me.